In the final years of the Second World War, as the tide of steel began to turn against the Third Reich, a new and terrifying reality emerged on the battlefield. It was a weapon that cost less than a uniform, required no training, and could be carried by a child. Yet it possessed the power to core a heavy tank like an apple. This was the Panzerfaust, the armor fist. To understand the Panzerfaust, one must first understand the desperation of 1943. The German infantry was being crushed by waves of Soviet T-34s and American Shermans, and the traditional anti-tank guns were too heavy to move and too easy to spot. The German High Command realized they didn't need a better tank. They needed to turn every single soldier, every civilian, and every street corner into a lethal threat. The Panzerfaust was the ultimate expression of this democratization of destruction. It was a weapon born of extreme necessity, a simple steel tube containing a black powder propellant and topped with a bulbous, oversized warhead. But within that crude shape lay a revolution in physics, the shaped charge. Unlike a traditional tank shell that relies on kinetic energy, speed, and weight to punch through armor, the Panzerfaust utilized the Munroe Effect. Inside the warhead sat a hollow copper cone backed by a high-explosive filler. When the warhead struck the flat plate of a tank, the explosive detonated, collapsing the copper cone into a hypersonic jet of molten metal. This jet, traveling at over 8,000 meters per second, didn't blow up the tank in the traditional sense. It focused all its energy into a needle-thin point, literally melting its way through thick steel armor as if it were butter. Once inside, the jet would spray the interior with superheated metal and pressure, instantly igniting ammunition and fuel. This meant that a weapon weighing only 5 kilograms could defeat the heaviest armor in the world. The design of the Panzerfaust was a masterpiece of disposable engineering. It was intended to be fired once and thrown away. There was no recoil in the traditional sense. The tube was open at both ends, allowing the backblast to vent out the rear, which neutralized the kick, but made it incredibly dangerous to fire in enclosed spaces or with anyone standing behind the operator. The sights were nothing more than a simple flip-up metal tab with holes for 30, 60, and 80 meters. It was a short-range, last-ditch weapon that required the user to have nerves of steel, waiting until a multi-ton engine of war was within spitting distance before pulling the trigger. When it first appeared, it fundamentally changed the psychology of the war. Allied tank crews, who had previously felt safe inside their steel cocoons, suddenly realized that any bush, any window, or any ditch could hide a weapon capable of killing them instantly. This wasn't the chivalrous tank-on-tank combat of the early war. This was a brutal, asymmetric nightmare. The Panzerfaust stripped away the tank's invincibility and handed it to the common man. It was the first step toward the modern battlefield, where expensive, high-tech vehicles are constantly threatened by cheap, man-portable explosives. As the Soviet armies closed in on Berlin, they found thousands of these tubes discarded in the streets, a testament to a weapon that was produced by the millions and distributed to anyone willing to hold a line. In this first look at the fist of the peasant, we see how a simple pipe and a bit of chemistry ended the era of the invincible tank and paved the way for the rise of the modern insurgent. It was crude, it was dangerous, and it was devastatingly effective. The final, desperate sting of a dying empire that would leave a permanent scar on the history of armored warfare. How this simple steel tube fundamentally altered the DNA of modern warfare and created the tactical blueprint for the next 80 years of global conflict. By 1944, the Panzerfaust had transitioned from a specialist tool into a ubiquitous symbol of total war. It was no longer just a weapon, it was an industrial strategy.
The German High Command, facing the total collapse of their logistics, realized that they could not outproduce the factories of Detroit or the Urals in heavy machinery, so they pivoted to a weapon that required no skilled labor to operate and almost no sophisticated materials to build. This shift turned the European theater into a lethal maze for Allied armor. In the bocage of Normandy and the dense urban centers of Germany, the tank, once the undisputed master of the battlefield, suddenly found itself vulnerable and exposed. The psychological impact on Allied tank crews cannot be overstated. Documents from the era describe a phenomenon known as Panzerfaust phobia. Tankers who had survived the long trek from the beaches of France began to refuse to enter villages or forested areas without a screen of infantry walking in front of them. The geometry of safety had shifted. A tank was now safest in the open and at its most vulnerable in the very places it was meant to provide support. This forced a massive change in Allied doctrine. They began to weld spare tracks, sandbags, and even wooden logs to the sides of their Shermans and T-34s in a desperate attempt to pre-detonate the Panzerfaust's jet of molten copper before it reached the main hull. While these field modifications were often ineffective against the raw power of the Munroe Effect, they highlighted the sheer terror the weapon inspired. However, the true legacy of the Panzerfaust was born in the ruins of the cities it failed to save. As the Soviet Union pushed into Berlin, they didn't just fear the Panzerfaust, they studied it. The Red Army captured hundreds of thousands of these devices and recognized immediately that the Germans had solved a problem the Soviets had been struggling with: how to give the individual soldier the power of a field gun. After the war, Soviet engineers took the basic principles of the Panzerfaust, the recoilless launch tube, the oversized external warhead, and the shaped charge, and refined them. This lineage led directly to the development of the RPG-2 and eventually the legendary RPG-7. The Panzerfaust was the biological father of the rocket-propelled grenade, the weapon that would define the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and every modern insurgency from the Middle East to Africa. It proved that a low-cost, disposable weapon could nullify the strategic advantage of an expensive, high-tech military. Furthermore, the Panzerfaust changed how we think about total war. In the final months of the Third Reich, the Panzerfaust was distributed to the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, consisting of elderly men and young boys. Because the Panzerfaust had no recoil and a simple sight, it was the first weapon in history that effectively erased the gap between a trained soldier and a civilian. This was a dark turning point in military history, as it made every non-combatant a potential tank killer, leading to increasingly brutal clearing operations by Allied forces who could no longer distinguish between a civilian and a threat. The weapon's simplicity was its greatest strength, but also its most tragic legacy, as it paved the way for the child-soldier dynamics seen in later 20th century conflicts. As we look at the modern battlefield today, we see the ghosts of the Panzerfaust everywhere. From the Javelin missiles in Ukraine to the NLAWs and the ubiquitous RPG, the armor fist philosophy remains the dominant force in infantry tactics. It taught the world that armor is a fragile thing, and that the peasant with a tube of explosives is the ultimate check on the power of the machine. The Tiger I may have been the king of the battlefield, but the Panzerfaust was the revolution that overthrew the monarchy. It was a weapon of desperation that became a weapon of destiny, changing the way we fight, the way we build, and the way we survive in the age of iron. The Panzerfaust didn't just destroy tanks, it destroyed the idea that a tank could ever be invincible again. It was the final stinging retort of a dying regime that in its last gasps handed the world the key to the destruction of the very machines it had spent a decade perfecting.